do as you think best.
So, good evening, everyone. My name is Denis Stolyarov. I'm an assistant curator here at Pushkin House, and usually I introduce speakers, but today obviously there is no need to introduce anyone. So Maxim, thank you for coming from Germany. Robert, thank you for coming, and I just wanted to mention that it is the first event since the pandemic that Robert has agreed to participate in at Pushkin House on our premises, so I'm really grateful and glad and honored. And also I just wanted to thank Emma from NYRB for providing all the assistance that we could ever have hoped for. So it's a brilliant event, and I'm looking forward myself to hearing your conversation, so thank you.
Thank you very much,
Same.
Dennis.
Yeah, it works now.
I'm Robert Chandler. I'm a translator myself. It's great to have Maxim here. He's a man who is a gift for many different fields of life. His previous roles have included being a doctor, really sort of getting a hospital on its feet in Tarusa, a small town not far from Moscow, and his own writing, most importantly. His new roles that he's taken on with great adeptness just recently include teaching at the University of Leiden, teaching Russian literature, and also starting up a new literary journal called The Fifth Wave. So wave as in these different waves of Russian emigres and exiles that there have been over the last 100 and more years. Just a word about these two books. I'm not one of the translators, at least two of the translators are here tonight, Nicholas Slater and Alex Fleming. The other one is Boris Dralyuk. But I do know a little about the process by which these books were translated. And one thing I know, which says quite a lot about Maxim, is that I don't know anyone else who has been so very thoughtful in the way they deal with their translators. So some writers nowadays write a sort of deliberately simplified language to make it easier for English translators because they're so conscious of the kind of world English language audience. But what Maxim does is, and he's someone who has lived for several years in the States, he has a very fine understanding of cultural differences, and he provides in advance a quite lengthy list of notes to the translator. You know, he has the ability to sort of guess what kind of things a translator may have problems with, whether it's a particular idiom or whether it's some aspect of Russian life that is very different from anything that most of us are familiar with. So that both is an important factor in contributing to how good these translations are, but it also says a lot about Maxim's own sensitivity to cultural difference, and that's a great part of the content of these stories. So, do you want to say anything about big opportunities before I start reading?
Well, this is a story that we selected. Oh, yeah, sorry. Do we actually need it? Yeah, we need it for recording, right? This is a shortest story I wrote, and I did it very quickly in 2 days. Normally it takes me months to write several pages. But this one is the shortest, and it is based on funny political circumstances, I would say. Funny and sad, of course, but in this case, more funny than sad. A friend of mine, well, maybe I tell the background later after we finish our reading. So this story has been written in September 2021, just before the war. Of course, we didn't know that the war will be broken out. So let us hear the English version, and then I will read in Russian. That was our idea, right?
I thought it'd be best to read the English first, because that will make it easier for those of us who have imperfect Russian to grasp it. I certainly, for myself, find it very difficult to take in anything in Russian at all long, just by ear. Opportunities, you understand? Soon he'd have enormous, almost limitless opportunities. He kept insisting on those opportunities that would open up for him soon, that lay just around the corner. She should know, though, he added, that he was doing just fine as it was, better than fine, better in any case than she could imagine. She, of course, hadn't the slightest intention of imagining his current opportunities, much less the ones at which he was hinting. All she needed was for him to deliver her as quickly as possible. Who can remember where after all this time? The editorial office, the party, the theatre? So what? She doesn't want to hear who he is. Oh, she knows well enough, but she won't say it. Another annoying, chatty driver, a gordonchik, one of a handful of words of Armenian slang she'd picked up from friends. Despite the cluster of consonants, gordonchik was still, in her opinion, far more euphonious, more affectionate than the Russian bombila, though it meant exactly the same thing, an unlicensed cabbie. This is Moscow in the 90s. Every other car is a cab. Raise your hand and someone's right there. How much? How much can you spare? No, he's no bombila, the fellow yammers on. And this isn't his car. He gets this one through his job. His own vehicle is totally different, of a whole other order, and he isn't about to ruin it on these roads. He didn't pick her up for the money either, pronounced either, with a kind of Jewish intonation, though he clearly isn't a Jew. Then again, he also doesn't look Russian. Maybe Komi, Chuvash, Udmurt. A small man, but with enormous, in his words, opportunities ahead of him. A rapid, choppy manner of speech, matched by a rapid, though generally careful manner of driving. A face that isn't exactly ugly, just expressionless. He's entitled, he says, to a personal driver, that he prefers to do everything himself. For the sake of encounters like this, maybe, but what's it to her? Stop over there. So that's it. Maybe she'd like to have lunch or dinner, get a meal together. Oh God, have you looked at yourself in the mirror? No, she doesn't want to offend him. His courtship, let's call it, wasn't arrogant, but rather naive, automatic, terribly foolish. He tried to seduce her, not with a show of prowess, of wit, or of talent, but with big opportunities. The only appealingly human thing about him was his speech impediment, a childish one. His S's sounded like sh's. She had tried to leave him 200 or maybe 20,000. She can't remember what the money was worth back then, but he refused to take it. Instead, he handed her a card with his personal number, saying he never gave this number out to anyone, hardly ever. So if she happened to change her mind, oh, certainly, merci. Victories of this sort don't bring even a hint of joy. And she would never have remembered the pint-size gordonchik. considering the number of men who had hit on her before and after, although seldom quite so clumsily, if not for an incident, an occurrence that changed her life forever. They showed up at her door early in the morning, 6 men and a dog, put her 18-year-old daughter in a car and took her away, and then they turned the apartment upside down. She was having the place renovated, and it had seemed to her that it couldn't be made more of a mess than it already was, but apparently it could. She was afraid for her daughter, felt all this was happening to someone else, not to them, not to her, and was ashamed, embarrassed by the piles of underwear, old letters, photographs. She also knew she needed to fight, of course, to call lawyers, say nasty things to these goons, but her life seemed to be over. What are you looking for, gentlemen? Gentlemen, right? Listen, on what basis are you searching my apartment? On the basis of an order, see for yourself. Extremism, terrorism, anarchism, social media records. When the time comes, she'll hear all about it. The dog alone behaved itself more or less decently, walked around, sniffed a few things, then plopped down. She gave it some water. "What's this?" the one in charge asks her, sounding for the first time the least bit interested. A real professional, he had found a card in the lining of an old purse. Name, surname, number, that very card. "Give it here." She snatches it from his hands, and without giving herself time to figure out what exactly she wants to say, makes the call. Yes, with the characteristic sh. Their conversation hardly lasts 2 minutes, and she's the only one talking. Tears, vows, pleas, not the moment for shyness or discretion. He finally says, in the same dispassionate tone in which he'd told her about his opportunities, "Pass the phone to the one in charge." The man goes out, then comes back. "All right, we'll lock her up for a long time if she doesn't leave the country by Tuesday. Never call that number again. Got it?" He grins. "Go over to the station and pick up your darling. Caesar, come." They leave. Life's fucking sense. A half-finished inscription on a fence. Author unknown. The good things, the best ones, are often anonymous. A number of years passed, quite a few years, because her daughter had since managed to graduate from the university in Lille, while the daughter's Moscow friends and acquaintances, boys and girls from good families just like hers, had managed to serve out their sentences in prisons and camps. They were given from 7 to 12 years. Well, after numerous adventures and travels, she herself had ended up in her own house in the south of France. And of course, all these years she'd been following, peripherally, out of the corner of her eye, the career of, it must be said, her benefactor, the Bombila, the Gordonchik, following it with a horror, since here and there, in Africa, Asia, and even at home, he was invariably to be found at the center of some unthinkable, unimaginable evil, in violation of all divine and human laws. Until finally she comes across an announcement that he's been awarded a Hero's Gold Star. His second, this time, however, posthumously, in an attempt to save the crew, and so on and so forth. implausible nonsense without even a single believable detail, which is of course never the point. He died a hero's death, along with some number of people. And to her, as to all commentators, it's perfectly obvious that all this official chatter is intended only to conceal, to drown in itself the shameful, disgusting truth of what had actually happened. A drunken death while out hunting, a political murder, or something of that sort. How strange, she thinks. He's lying there in a deluxe coffin, powdered and made up, with his enormous, limitless opportunities, waiting to be buried in the best cemetery, next to writers, artists, and composers, all to the sounds of beautiful music that he probably never liked. And would you want to find out that the announcement of his death was false? No, better not to ask oneself such a question. He had done her a favour, been good to her, while to everyone else, and judging by the terrible things they write and say about him, he had been exclusively bad. All right. Does she feel sorry for this little man with his childish speech impediment? After all, she owes a very great deal to him, if not her own life, her daughter's freedom, this south of France. Maybe she does feel sorry. A little.
Thank you very much.
And that was Boris Draluk's translation.
Okay, now I read it in Russian, and I will do it fast, because I like to read this story fast. Normally, I prefer to read slowly, but you know, each story has its own tempo, and this one is really like allegro con brio. Большие возможности. Вообразите себе возможности. Скоро у него будут большие, практически неограниченные возможности. Он настаивал именно на возможностях, которые перед ним откроются непременно, причем в самые ближайшие времена. Пусть она имеет в виду, говорил он, что у него все хорошо и теперь, прямо отлично. Много лучше, во всяком случае, чем она может себе представить. Она, разумеется, никак не представляла себе ни теперешних его возможностей, ни тем более тех, на которые он намекал. Ей всего-то надо было от него, чтобы довез поскорей. Уже и не вспомнишь куда, в редакцию, в гости, в театр. Ей что же, выходит, неинтересно послушать, кто он такой? О, она, кажется, знает, но не станет произносить. Еще один приставучий болтливый водитель, гордончик. Одно из нескольких слов по-армянски, жаргонных, которым ее научили друзья. Гордончик, несмотря на проблемы с гласными, куда благозвучнее, ласковее, чем бомбила по-нашему, хотя означает ровно то самое. Это Москва, каждый второй автомобиль тут такси. Только поднимешь руку и «Сколько? А сколько дашь?» Нет, он не бомбила. Этот все продолжает бубнить. И машина, на которой они сейчас едут, она не его собственная, а служебная. У самого у него имеется совершенно другая тачка. Другой, как он выразился, аппарат. Но он не собирается его на наших колдобинах убивать. А подобрал он ее не потому, что нуждается в деньгах, с ударением на первый слог, очень по-местечковому. Хотя уж кем-кем, и евреем он быть не мог. Но и на русского не похож. Коми, чуваш, удмурт. Маленький, но с громадными, по его словам, возможностями впереди. Быстрый и дробный такой говорок, и быстрая, но аккуратная в целом манера вождения. Лицо хоть и не безобразное, но и не выражающее ничего. Ему, продолжает он, полагается личный водитель, однако он предпочитает все делать самостоятельно. Уж не ради таких ли вот встреч, впрочем, ей-то какое дело, остановите вон там. Так она, пообедать, поужинать, вместе покушать. О, Господи, в зеркало давно смотрел на себя. Нет-нет, зачем обижать? Да и его ухаживание, так это назовем, было не наглым, а каким-то наивным, автоматическим, глупым до чрезвычайности. Ни удаль, ни ум, ни талант, а большие возможности. Вот чем он пытался ее соблазнить и привлечь. Из человеческого, пожалуй, что только дефект речи. Детский какой-то. Он смешно выговаривал букву «Ш». Попробовала оставить ему то ли 200 рублей, то ли 20 тысяч. Она совершенно не помнит, какие суммы были тогда в ходу. Отказался. Сунул ей карточку с личным номером. Сказал: он этот номер вообще никому не дает. Никогда. Почти. Так что если она передумает, непременно. Мерси. Победы, подобные этой, не приносят и тени радости, и она никогда бы не вспомнила низкорослого гордончика, мало ли кто волочился за ней до и после, хотя так нелепо, как он, мало кто, если бы не случай, не происшествие, сильнейшим образом изменившее жизнь. Утром рано пришли 6 и собака, 18-летнюю дочь ее посадили в машину и увезли, а квартиру перевернули вверх дном, хотя у них шел ремонт, и казалось, сильнее переворачивать некуда, выяснилось, что есть, еще как. Страх за дочь, ощущение того, что все происходит не с ними, не с ней, стыд от сваленных в кучу белья, старых писем, фотографий родных и чувство, что надо бороться, конечно, звать адвокатов, говорить гадости этим жлобам. Но жизнь, в общем, кончилась. Что вы ищете, господа? Какие они к черту и господа? Граждане, на каком основании производится обыск в моей квартире? На основании ордера. Вот. Экстремизм, терроризм, анархизм, записи в сети интернет. Когда надо будет, я объяснят. Только собака вела себя более-менее пристойно, походила, понюхала и улеглась безучастно. Она дала собаке воды. «Это что?» – спрашивает ее старший, и впервые в его голосе слышится интерес. Профессионал обнаружил в старой сумке на антресолях за рваной подкладкой карточку. Имя, фамилия, номер, ту самую. «Дайте сюда». Она выхватывает карточку из рук старшего и, не дав себе времени сообразить, что именно хочет сказать, звонит. «Слушаю», с характерным «ша». Разговор их длится едва ли минуту-две, да и говорит она одна. Слезы, клятвы, мольба, не время стесняться. Он, наконец, произносит все тем же бесстрастным тоном, которым рассказывал ей про возможности. «Передайте трубку старшему». Тот выходит, потом возвращается. «Значит так, закроем ее надолго, если до вторника не выйдет из страны. По номеру этому никогда не звоните. Поняли?» Усмехается. «Идите в отделение, забирайте свое сокровище. Цезарь, за мной». Ушли. Жизнь отымела смысл. Надпись, сделанная на заборе. Автор надписи неизвестен. Часто хорошая, самая лучшая, автора не имеет. Как частушка, пословица, анекдот. И теперь, спустя сколько-то лет, немало, потому что дочь ее за это время закончила университет в Лиле, московские подруги и друзья дочери, такие же, в общем, девочки и мальчики из хороших семей, успели отсидеть в тюрьмах и лагерях, кто весь срок, а кто часть его, им дали от 7 до 12. А сама она после многочисленных приключений и переездов оказалась в собственном доме на юге Франции. И, конечно, все эти годы она краем глаза, боковым зрением следит за карьерой своего, необходимо признать, благодетеля, водила-бомбила, гордончика, следит с ужасом. Поскольку то там, то сям, в Африке, Азии, а то и на родине, он непременно оказывается в центре какого-то немыслимого, непредставимого зла с нарушением всех божеских и человеческих правил. Пока, наконец, ей не попадается сообщение о том, что его наградили звездой, орденом, во второй уже раз, но теперь, однако, посмертно. Что, пытаясь спасти экипаж и так далее, малоправдоподобная чушь без попытки поместить в нее истинные подробности. Впрочем, им и не место тут. Он погиб смертью храбрых, и с ним еще столько-то человек. И ей, как и всем комментаторам, совершенно ясно, что вся эта официальная болтовня должна только скрыть, утопить в себе то позорное, гадкое, что случилось на самом деле. Пьяную смерть на охоте, политическое убийство или что-нибудь в том же роде. Как странно, думает она, подкрашенный, припудренный. Он лежит теперь со своими огромными, неограниченными возможностями в дорогущем гробу и ждет, когда под прекрасную музыку, которую вряд ли любил, его похоронят на самом что ни на есть лучшем кладбище, рядом с писателями, артистами и композиторами. А хотела ли бы она, чтобы сообщение о самой гибели его оказалось ложным? Нет, такой вопрос себе лучше не задавать. Ей-то он сделал только хорошее, тогда как всем остальным только плохое, судя по тому, какую про него пишут и говорят жуть. Хорошо. Жалко ли ей этого маленького человека с детским дефектом речи? Она ведь ему обязана пусть не жизнью, но очень и очень многим. Свободой дочери, этим вот югом Франции. Может и жалко. Чуть-чуть. Okay, that's it. Thank you. There are a couple places here. Yeah. There are empty seats. Yeah. So I promised to tell the story. A friend of mine, ex-colleague of mine, very handsome, very nice-looking woman, stopped the car in the 90s and had this conversation about big opportunities. And then, of course, she almost forgot this man. And just, at the end of year 2021, she saw on television, she saw Shoigu, our present Minister of Defense, who actually has very funny speech impediment. He says, instead of saying R, in Russian we say R, like Tavarish, Россия, whatever. He says R, not even, you know, or in English manner, you know, Tavarish. And she immediately recognized this man because she remembered him from this past. And she told me this story, so I decided to put down into my diary this remarkable event, and then I just added 2 more paragraphs about, you know, what happened later. So Shoigu is alive, as you probably aware. So yeah, that's the story.
Thank you. So there are 1 or 2 things I'd like to say and ask myself, but I think first of all, let's maybe some of you have some questions you'd like to ask Maxim.
Well, I'm not a great expert on Russian literature, but with Robert I've read some Tefi, and the part where she is taken by an entrepreneur to Crimea and then moves on. And do you see a connection? This idea that when societies are falling apart, it's just these chance things that determine whether people, well, whether they live or die. In fact, it becomes so unpredictable.
Didn't really get the question. Do I see the
So
connection between
yes,
what? Between Crimea and...
No, between the stories that you and Tefi also were writing, that as a society falls apart, it's just such a chance whether people survive or not.
Well, I'm not a scholar of Tefi, and I'm not a scholar of my own writings, really. So if you see connection, then there is probably, but...
I think the question most of all is about the sort of randomness of the randomness of you know, these events that either save one's life or bring one catastrophe, and she's seeing a similarity between random events in Tefi's, you know, how she left Russia and the random event that saved this woman. So,
well, possibly. I don't really know what to say. Well, of course, it's a piece of fiction. The fact that it is based on, you know, a little bit on true story, which is not really the story. I invented this story, and the difference between stories and reality. That reality, in fact, it has no plot. We, you know, very often we see some plots, some fabulas in real life, but in fact, you know, there is no fabula there. So maybe Tefi and I observed, you know, similar Russia in sort of similar circumstances, although even circumstances are not that similar. Although, you know, you can find some similarity in immigration, actually. The people that are leaving now, this 5th wave, it's actually probably closer to the 1st wave, to any of, you know, than to the 2nd, to 3rd and 4th. Did I answer a question?
Yes, you did.
Okay.
I hope you won't mind if I add a little translator and writer, Michel Bierdi, an American who's been living in Moscow for well over 30 years, and amongst other things, she was writing for the Moscow Times. She eventually, very late in the day, realized that she needed to get out of Russia. But shortly before that, I'd been approached by I think Columbia University Press, they were preparing an anthology, they were compiling an anthology of Russian Istanbul. So Istanbul, Constantinople, was the first stop for a lot of Russian emigres in the first wave. And Teffy had written a few little sketches devoted to her time there. And the press were asking me if I would translate them. And I had an awful lot of other things to do, and I knew that Michelle really loved Teffy and that she has exactly that kind of grace and lightness and wit. So I persuaded the press to take on Michelle. And then, you know, within about 2 months of that, Michelle was in exactly the same circumstances as Teffy herself. You know, she was wondering whether to, her particular difficulty was that she had a dog to which she was very devoted, a therapy dog that she used to take to hospitals. So she had to find a way of leaving Russia that she could take the dog with her. And Istanbul actually was one of the possibilities, but eventually she left in a minivan with a huge pile of luggage, 6 passengers and 3 dogs, and they made their way to Riga through Estonia. And so anyway, you know, then Michelle was translating Teffy. So sorry to interrupt with that story, but it was the similarity was very, very striking. But some more questions for Maxim. Yes?
I really only know the book Kilometer 101, but I was always struck by the stories having their origins in a real person. I mean, Luxembourg plays with that in the way that you've constructed it, that the main character seems to be like your old friend. And the last story, The Whilst, you then say you're having a drink with one of the main characters in that, both having fled Russia in Yerevan. Are there any other stories like the one you told about big possibilities that came from someone you knew? Or is it just a device?
Well, Luxembourg is not based on any character whom I know. I use some biographical facts of my own life and of, you know, some other lives, but the character is not something that I had in mind. There is no person I had in mind. As for The Whilst, yes, it was a real story at one of the departments with a friend of mine who was fired very, you know, recently, just before the war, with whom we left Russia the same day, actually on March 4th last year. But again, I don't think it's really that important to, you know, sometimes it is somehow connected, sometimes it doesn't, so it, you know. Robert, maybe you ask your questions. You must have.
I'd like to ask you a little about the journal you're starting, The Fifth Wave. Maxim has written a little about this to me already, and is obviously very conscious of the important journals that have been published by Russian emigres and exiles, both in the 19th and
Where is the picture?
20th century. So I wondered what, well, firstly, if there's any one or two of the historical journals that you particularly admire and that you sort of feel made a particular contribution to Russia and Russian literature, and what you hope for with your own journal.
Okay, well, first of all, I was a publisher for many years. I was doing huge medical textbooks, translations from English into Russian, as long as 3,000 pages, and with 40 translators, 8 editors, like big big company, and so I have some knowledge on the process. But of course, having your own literary magazine is somewhat different. And my Dutch publisher, Van Oorschot, they, at the first day when I arrived to Amsterdam, where I live now, he proposed that I start a magazine of Russian literature in exile. It's not, in fact, an exile, because some people are still living, some authors are still living in Russia, and some people live in Ukraine. When the person lives in Ukraine, it's not an exile, obviously. Just they write in Russian. And some are, living in America, in Israel, in Georgia, elsewhere. So I called it the Fifth Wave. And here you can see the cover to the left and the contents. Well, for some reason, the slides, something went wrong, but doesn't matter. So here is a translation of the last paragraph from editorial that I wrote for the first volume. The Fifth Wave project is literary, not socio-political. That's something. Yeah, we plan to feature existing well-crafted work in various genres, including poetry, fiction, art history, memoir, etc., and not only on the burning topics of the day. The contributors will be solicited from authors living in Russia and abroad, all of whom are united by their rejection of war and totalitarianism, their love for Russian culture as part of European culture, their sense of personal involvement in and responsibility for what is happening, and their desire to see Russia as a free, peace-loving country, no matter how far-fetched this wish may seem. So this is sort of a manifesto, of what we would like to see in this magazine. And the first volume will be ready very, very soon, in maybe couple of weeks. So it will be both in Russian and in English, and it will be in electronic form and in printed version, distributed on demand. I will not go into further details, because I'm sure it's just initial plan that can really change. So this is my plan. This is what I'm doing now.
Just one point of interest: will the journal appear in two alternative versions, one Russian and one English?
Yes. Yeah, I don't think it makes any sense to combine those. It's not, and possibly there will be fewer English issues than Russians, because not everything is really that interesting to English-speaking audience. So, but we will see.
Thank you very much. I had two questions. I'll put them both. It's more than my fair share, but nevertheless. The first relates to the fifth wave. Is there, in your view, what is specific about the fifth wave, each of the waves of immigration, apart from the fact that it's now and so on linked to the war, but is there, in sort of cultural, historical terms already, can you say something about the fifth wave as opposed to the other waves of Russians leaving at various times? And the other is looking at that prospectus with regard to Russian literature now. Would you say that Russian literature now remains a thing in the singular, so to speak, or could you say that Russian literature now remains a thing in the singular, so to speak, or can one see in Russian literature the beginnings of the kind of distinction you have in English literature between English proper and Anglophone, Francophone and French, Lusophone and Portuguese, Spanish and Hispanic, so to speak? That is to say that the fact of being in one language nevertheless doesn't necessarily mean the same thing?
Okay. Both questions are very, very good. So about waves. The first wave was after revolution in 1917, and it lasted for several years. The second was the most silent, I would say. It was mostly from people who were taken to Germany and remained there, Ostarbeiter, Then the third wave was mostly Jewish, but not necessarily Jewish. It was in the 70s. It started in the 70s and ended by the beginning of the 80s. And then the fourth one was at the beginning of the 90s, after USSR collapsed. And it was mostly economical, but not necessarily for economical reasons. There were many scientists who found impossible to work in this brave new world. So this current one is the fifth, and it is similar to the first, I think, in terms that none of us actually planned to leave the country. I did not have these plans. Actually, well, of course I thought about the possibility, and you can even feel it in many stories, but I made a decision not to leave. And the second thing is that, well, of course, those who left, they do not support necessarily war supporters or something. People have different circumstances. I was lucky because all my family left, with me, and I had enough means to do that. It's a very difficult thing, actually. Even money-wise, it required tens of thousands of euros to do that. Even each set of tickets was like Moscow to Yerevan, Yerevan to Europe. Each set was like 5,000, 6,000 euros. So my daughter lived already in Germany, so we had a place to go. Yeah, again, it's just and plus I was lucky to find. Well, I didn't think about it initially. I thought maybe me and my son would go to Georgia and practice medicine there. So we had no exact plans, but I was lucky that I was invited here and there. And Jeremy Adler, who is sitting here, made it possible for me to go to Wissenschaftskolleg zu Berlin, which was a wonderful place and a wonderful beginning of immigration for me. So it's a matter of luck and of energy and whatever, not necessarily, I said. So, and there are many intellectual or professionals, I would say, who are leaving, of course. Musicians, engineers, computer scientists, whoever. So this is about this waves. And the second question, I'm sorry, it was what it was?
Whether Russian literature
is it still uniform?
Separate into different Russian.
No, I don't think it. Yeah, surprisingly, Russian language, although it has been spoken, from Kaliningrad to far east, and of course a lot of brilliant writers and poets live in America, in Israel, elsewhere. Russian language is still uniform. We don't have dialects. It's not that, Portuguese language in Portugal or in Brazil, or, even German language in Austria or in Switzerland or in Germany. So it's still the same language, and I don't think the language necessarily, this language doesn't belong to Russian, to the country of Russia. So our most prominent, probably, poet who died last year, Alexei Tsvetkov, he spent most of his life outside of Russia, and he wrote wonderful Russian poems.
Can I ask one? I suppose. Hello, hello. Yes.
Yeah.
I suppose I didn't so much mean the language, in that, you know, British Indian literature, American literature, all, one can say linguistically, they're linked. It's more to do with a sense of identity and culture. I mean, would one call a Ukrainian Russophone writer a Russian writer, so to speak? Are there different identities within the Russian language world of literature, in the same way as there are different identities within the English language world of literature?
Well, I am not. Give me some time of for publish several volumes, because we have here in this magazine we have two authors who live in Israel permanently, one who lives in Kiev. I don't see much cultural difference between them and those two poets who live in Moscow still. But maybe later on we will see bigger something, some different roots and whatever. So, yeah.
Hey, I have two. We know each other. Two things. One of your first works that rose to some sort of prominence was 101st Kilometer, which was all centered into that small town south of Moscow called Tarusa. I confess I have some relation to it. Two things. One, what does make a doctor who takes on a huge mission to rebuild a basically almost non-existent hospital, a formality, to turn into a writer? And B, you left it over a year ago. What's up with the hospital?
Well, the hospital is still there, and my very brilliant colleague Artemia Khotin is taking care of the therapeutic and cardiology ward. Well, it's one of the biggest pains I have, but that's how things are. For me, staying in Russia would be, I just woke up on the 6th day of war. Well, at day 1 of war, me and several other people, not many of us, went to the center of Tarusa, which you know very well. I think I even may have a picture of it somewhere. Yeah, so I was staying there near Lenin's statue with a small banner saying, Abel, Cain, where is your brother Abel? So police didn't really detain us because they knew us and they preferred not to notice at all. And really it was, very uncrowded, I would say. And then on the day 5, my Spanish publisher asked me to write something, and I wrote a short essay very, very quickly, The Fifth Day of War. You can find the English translation immediately made by Boris in Los Angeles Review of Books. And then on March 4th, I just on March 2nd, I think, I woke up with the feeling that of fear, disgust, anger, and I knew that this feeling would, I would have similar feelings all my life from now on. So it was just like a decision of, to divorce. It happened seemingly suddenly, really. So that was it. And as for writing, as for your first question, well, I think that feeling yourself a writer really comes much earlier than the actual process of writing. So I had this feeling since beginning of the 90s. I was just too lazy or too indecisive to start. And I'm glad I didn't start too early, because otherwise, things are, as they are. I do not write much because, I think there are writers who have something to say or who think they have something to say. And I do not belong to this type of writers. So I learn what I want to say while writing. That's why. Okay. Yes, please.
Good evening. I've read your book, Rock, Scissors and Paper. I haven't read the Kilometer 101 yet. But in that book, there are lots of stories set in the theatre. And I was wondering if you thought you might write another play.
Well, I wrote 3 plays, and one of these plays is still... they still perform it once a month, to my greatest surprise. In Dodin Theater, which is a very famous theater in St. Petersburg. So they do it like once a month. Couple actors left the country, so they replaced them, but they still do it quite accurately. I don't think I would write more plays. No. Because who would perform them? You need to have in mind specific theater, I think, when you write. But who would perform these plays those days in Russia? Because I will write in Russian anyway, right? So no more plays, I guess. But who knows? In Amsterdam, they are going to stage one of my stories this fall. It's After Eternity, but it will be in Dutch, so I will have to guess what is it about. Nicholas.
You write with a very observant, sort of wry approach, ironic and critical. And I just wonder whether you think, I'm sure it's too early to say, do you think that you will find yourself writing stories that reflect your present Dutch surroundings?
I don't know, it's a big question and quite painful for me, actually, because you need some understanding, at least, semi-understanding of what is going on when you write. And here, I don't really have this understanding. I remember being in Barcelona recently, and my Luis, Spanish publisher, I asked him, who are these women across the street? They were semi-naked. I said, are they prostitutes? And he said, no, they are foreigners. And I said, how do you know they are foreigners? And he said, well, I know they are foreigners. If I were they are just going from one party to another. It's obvious, although we couldn't hear them. Or I went recently to pick up an order in the cafe in Frankfurt with my son-in-law, who speaks wonderful German. He speaks like Franz Beckenbauer, I don't know. So we went there, and there was a man in the street. He was not homeless, but obviously he was a man who spends a lot of time in the streets with a dog. And he just called this dog and said, Adolf, go. And we just, turned to him, and he said, and he smiled and said, I called my dog Adolf. And he laughed and went away. And I said, what does that mean? Is he a Nazi, or is he anti-Nazi, or is he just a joker? In Russia, I would immediately, from some small signs, I would tell. But there, even my son-in-law, who lives there since 2008, he couldn't tell me. What was it? And Germans whom I asked about that, they said, you missed something. I mean, you clearly missed some important details. Yeah, so that's, I'm doomed to miss these details. So I will have to write about, I don't know, about what, about immigration. I don't know. We will see. Robert, oh yeah.
Hello.
I'd like to ask about your teaching. Maxim has been teaching at the University of Leiden, certainly teaching quite a number of the Russian classics. Has this kind of given you any, I mean, it's the first time you've been teaching as far as I know, has this given you any sort of new understandings of writers you've known all your life?
Well, it does, actually, yes, because when I first, when I agreed to do that, I do not have formal humanitarian education or whatever. So my approach was, of course, I read some criticism, some classical works about this and that, but mainly I selected stories that that has something to do with my own life, my experience, or which make my eyes wet for some reason, and try to explain why it is not like, a museum art, something sitting there, ancient story, and we just have to read it, have to know it. But how it is applicable to our current events and situations. So I started with, initially it was very hard, because to talk for an hour and a half about Captain's Daughter in English to our Dutch students, it was not an easy task. But at the end, I think, they liked it. Only 1 or 2 students dropped the class. I had like 18 students. And we read, quite a number of works of Pushkin, of Chekhov, of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and of 20th century, Liskov, and of Babel, etc., Platonov. They loved Platonov, So for me, yeah, plus, well, I had teaching experience in medicine, but when you teach medicine, when you teach echocardiography or cardiology in general, there is no goal that the students would love echocardiography. They have to learn it, But with Russian literature, it wouldn't make sense if they could take a class of Norwegian literature or whatever, dancing. So I was quite happy that they seemed to like stories that we read. Yeah, you had some question, but yeah.
Hello, I have a lot of questions, but you can choose. So I have a question about the fifth wave. I have a question about, in regards with the reading group that I'm co-facilitating, and I have a personal question. Which way do you want to go?
Let's start with personal.
I knew you were going to say that. I wrote it 3 times and I just crossed it out because I couldn't choose. I guess I want to know what your writer's heaven looks like right now, if you can imagine. So it's the place where you are inspired and you can keep your routine and be productive as a writer.
So the question is, can you rephrase it? It's not really, I didn't really get it.
Okay, I can rephrase it. So as a writer, What is your favorite place to write?
Oh, I don't have this place. When I write, I write. I can do it elsewhere, in the cafe, in subway, in, you know, when I don't drive a car any longer because I left it to my son in Frankfurt. But I loved to, very often I had good ideas on a high speed, not in the traffic. In the traffic it makes you, you know, really sad and sleepy, and but on high speed, and very often I just turned on the microphone and just dictate. So it really, when it happens elsewhere.
That sounds wonderful. It's a good place to
But it doesn't happen too often, unfortunately.
No. So, do you want more questions, or?
Yes, please.
Okay, so in regards with the fifth wave, which sounds very exciting, how would you describe the identity of this project right now, in the beginning?
How do I describe the identity? Well, it's independent Russian writing. That's the identity. And I think I described it when I read the editorial. We would not take gifted, you know, authors if they, for some reason, write pro-war poem or something. So, or some, you know, we take. We would like to work with authors who have same, you know, or you know, similar views on the Russian culture as part of European, you know, the willingness to see Russia free, etc., etc. I won't repeat it. It was there, I think.
Thank you. Okay, the last one. I co-facilitate the reading group at Pushkin House. Some of the people in here go to this group, and people suggest books. Me and Alisa, another facilitator, choose them, and then we discuss them. The group runs in person here in this room, and once a month online. And the youngest participant is 17, and the oldest one is 250. So it's a wide audience.
200.
I'm joking. Just like, you know, a very respectable age. And there are people from different countries, and the online group sees everyone from US to Australia, and they've got very different backgrounds and love for literature. I've not read your work, but I've been looking at your books for ages, thinking, is this the one? Is this the one? Is this the next one? And I'm glad I'm here today, because I wanted to ask you, if we were reading Kilometer 101, can you think of a question that would be important for you to ask the readers or discuss at the group?
No, I don't think it would be a good idea if I
Come on, make my job easier.
No, really, it should go independently from my, you know, readers should make their own judgments, and it's not that I know it better. Well, of course I know it better, but I may have some wrong ideas about what I wrote actually, and what it means for reader of this 250-year-old or whoever.
Yeah. Tricky. Thank you, and thank you, Robert.
Josephine?
Thank you. Question relating to your journal. Are you collaborating with other, I mean, lots of people at the moment are doing alternative Russian culture, i.e. Russian culture that has nothing to do with the war, and then there is Lino Goralik's project, Russian oppositional art review. Are you collaborating with anybody, or is it like completely separate? And if so, what's different to other projects?
Well, I'm not really very much aware of other projects, and I prefer to keep distant from other you know, producers of, well, you know, it's we are all, we have all difficult, we are in difficult situations, and people get, you know, I prefer not to deal that much with Russian immigrants, to tell you the truth. So I would prefer to just communicate with them through emails and, you know, and reading what they write, and that's it. Sorry for being that honest, but it's yeah, Jeremy.
Sorry.
Cold, ashamed, relieved is an extremely visceral text, very sharp, cutting, and painful. And I wonder whether you would consider writing a sequel at some future date, which looks back on that territory and cuts it from the same meat, because this piece is just so strong. It seems to cry out for an answer or a continuation or a revisit. I don't know how you feel about that.
Just in case anyone hasn't grasped all that, let me just add that Jeremy's referring to one of Maxim's first published articles after leaving Russia.
Yeah, it's there on the screen to the right. Yeah.
Which is a very, very remarkable piece indeed. Please do read it.
Well, I didn't think of...
It's a classic.
Okay.
Yes.
We would like more of that.
Well, I would take that into consideration. No, I don't think I have enough material, really. But yeah, well, let me just. Well, I don't know. I don't want to give any promises. Of course, I make some notes, and maybe something would come out of it. But it's like it's really unpredictable. With this, even non-fiction, I had this. The last story in this book is "Children of Jankoy." In Russian, it sounds very good. I think "Дети Jankoya," and I heard that years ago, and then I thought, well, I should write a story with this title, "Дети Jankoya," because it's you know, it's "Дети Jankoya." It's so nice. So I thought of maybe it would be a horse with this name. Jankoy, in fact, is a city in Crimea, and it's, well, this story has nothing to do with Jankoy at all. But so maybe a dog, you know, and then something happened, and I got the impulse to make a story. So it could happen. It may not happen. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for your very kind words, Jeremy.
I have a question myself. So you mentioned that you are teaching essentially Russian literature to students. So there is a huge discussion going on about the need to look at Russian at the imperial tendencies in Russian classical literature critically. You know, all the writers romanticizing imperial wars, Wronski living, you know, to a colonial war in effect at the end of the novel, all the Orientalist images, you know, in Pushkin and Tolstoy. So, and there is a huge discussion among specialists in Russian literature, you know, that there are a lot of things long overdue. So, as in your new role as an educator, do you feel a certain responsibility in this respect?
Well, it's a big question, and I was in the United States recently, and there they asked me this question very, very often, and when I gave the answer, there was a silence in the audience, especially in academic, and then some professor would say, no, I object it. because of political correctness and incorrectness of what I was saying. Well, first of all, I think it's a bad idea to judge Pushkin. Well, Pushkin loved the empire. This is true, but he also gave. He had slaves, serfs. He gave some instructions on how to seduce women in his poetry. So he was totally politically incorrect. If you look at it, from perspective. Also, he wrote the Подражание Корану, the imitation of Quran. Should we judge him for Islamic extremism or not? Also Lermontov, for example, he was anti-imperialistic writer. He said, I love Russia, I don't know why, definitely not for that and that in some of his poems. You mentioned Tolstoy, but Tolstoy wrote Haji Murat. Haji Murat was anti-imperialistic thing. Even Kazaki was not that, in favor of empire. Also, I would say that which culture is not imperialistic? Is British culture not imperialistic? Why do we speak English? I mean, when I go to Belgium or elsewhere, if I were Romanian or Korean, I would still speak English there. Also, empire is not just a negative thing. Roman Empire brought people law and roads and hygiene and aqueducts and whatever. So the problem is that Putin is a criminal and he has nothing to give to Ukraine at all, and Ukraine doesn't ask him. That's the thing. Why didn't we speak about imperialistic nature of Russian culture when USSR collapsed, seemingly peacefully? So it's a fashionable. Plus, I don't like fashion. I would not write stories about gender. I would not write stories about searching roots. Everyone is searching their roots these days. And I would not write about imperialistic nature of Russian culture. I think it's just a fashionable thing. And it seems that Pushkin wrote one poem, Klevetnikam России, and Brodsky wrote one poem on the independence on Ukraine, which he even didn't publish. But no one would, even discuss other poems of Brodsky. I don't like fashion. That's the thing. Did I answer your question somehow?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question. Is your literature a painkiller, or is for entertainment, or it's something that irritates people and make them think over some things?
Well, you could look at it, either way. For me, it's.
What is your goal to?
Well, it's art. The best definition of art that I know belonged to a late friend of mine who was a priest, and he said, art is self-development of truth. So I think it's self-development of truth in its best, but it could also be entertainment, I don't know. Yeah.
Sort of following on from that, has anyone ever, has any critic or anybody ever interpreted any of your stories or any of your works in a way that either shocked or surprised you, or someone or that irritated you if it was someone interpreting it through a sort of fashionable lens? Please tell us if that's the case.
No, I think, well, when I just began to write, I reacted on critics very, emotionally, I would say. But it lasted only just 1 or 2 years. And then I read what Bergman, film director, said that a writer, an artist, and a critic, there should be a neutral space between them, and then they should not communicate in any way, never. So I almost never react. Sometimes I say thank you, when it is on Facebook, or I just thank you very much, for your kind words, but I never go deeper than that. Mm. No, never, no. Well, the best readers are, I think, translators are very good readers, because they have to do it slowly. And also, in a different way, actors. Actors are very, very good readers. They also have to, and I got very, good critics from non-professional, really, people who just gave some suggestions, to whom there is a circle, of course, to whom I show the piece before I send it to a magazine or elsewhere.
We have a question from somebody within the online audience. So Sally Richards asks, does Maxim see himself within the tradition of Russian literary doctors?
Well, finally. Well, what could I say? I'm a doctor. I became a doctor when I was 23. So for me, it's hard to think of being anybody else. I guess if I were a chemist or engineer, I would have another set of metaphors. But I don't think it really, well, I think it's exaggerated, a bit exaggerated. People tend to romanticize doctoral work. So of course it affected, because I deal with, well, in the past I did, with many different kind of people. So I don't have to apply, to have to tell about stories like many people speak about taxi drivers, because it's the only place where they communicate with so-called, normal people, whatever. Простые люди. Yeah, so for a doctor there is no necessity to talk to taxi drivers. But, other than that, I think it's exaggerated. Plus, which tradition does it form? Chekhov and Bulgakov and Verisayev, they are all three are so different. Plus, it's not unique Russian thing. Carlos Williams was pediatrician. What is it in common between, Chekhov and Carlos Williams, or Celine? He was a doctor too. And Friedrich Schiller was a doctor. So I don't think there is a tradition,
I'd like to add something myself in a kind of oblique connection to that. A passage I found especially moving in my native land. You probably mostly have read that this title, Kilometer 101, is because in the 1930s mainly, the people were exiled. People perhaps who'd been freed from the camps were allowed to live anywhere that was at least, it had to be at least 101 kilometers from one of the major cities. And
no, it was throughout the whole, so USSR actually. It ended up with Brezhnev, with Andropov,
Okay, thank you. So anyway, Tarusa, happened to be just precisely that distance, and it's quite an attractive place with a river and so on. So a lot of dissidents chose Tarusa as somewhere to live, and so I knew all that, and I knew I'd read about Maxim's great-grandfather having been one of these 101 kilometer people after being released from the Gulag. But I hadn't actually, until I read this particular piece, I hadn't read this extraordinarily moving couple of paragraphs, which I would really love to read. So the other day, I got a nod from my great-grandfather, who died soon after I was born. I commented to a patient of mine that she had an unusual and beautiful name, Ruth. Ruth the foreigner, Ruth Chujistranka, I said. And she replied, there's only been one doctor that noticed my name, and he liked me a lot for it, and I went to his home too. That doctor was my great-grandfather. When he'd done his time in the Gulag, he lived and died at Kilometer 101 in the town of N. Nowadays, they don't send people to Kilometer 101 anymore. You have to get there under your own steam. So that seems, I find that extraordinarily moving, all the more so because apart from just the continuity, extraordinary continuity of treating someone who once great, I mean, I only knew one of my grandfathers, let alone great-grandfathers, and to be treating someone who your great-grandfather treated, extraordinary feeling of continuity in a country that has been that has suffered such sort of terrible schisms and interruptions. And then that it should be this particular name. I mean, Ruth in the Bible is this symbol of loyalty. That is the essential thing about her, is her sense of loyalty. And I feel that that's one of the things that most impresses me about everything to do with Maxim's work, is a kind of sense of loyalty to many different things, to music. Music is, musical structure is immensely important to truth, to not sort of, surrendering to fashionable oversimplifications, and to kind of a loyalty to, I suppose, morality. That's, there are some boundaries that you're not prepared to cross, and I'm sure that perhaps more than the sort of tradition of Chekhov or Bulgakov, that connection to a great-grandfather seems immensely important.
Well, thank you for saying that. Probably it's a good ending of the evening. What do you think? Or we should...
Maybe it is. And if there's nothing more you want to say yourself, Maxim.
No, I'm just... Well, thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Maxim. Thank you, Robert. Join me. I just wanted to mention the things that we are